There it is. Okay,
Thanks,
Matt,
Sal.
the floor is yours.
Cool. Well, I just want to thank Sal and everyone with the chapter for having me. And thanks for coming out on a Friday night. I don't know if you guys always do this on a Friday, but it's
Yeah.
a holiday and a Friday. And so I appreciate your dedication. I wanted to start by saying how cool it is to sort of interact with folks from Stanislaus in particular, knowing the community science work that you do for your Christmas bird counts at 2 different locations, the scholarship program you have, that's pretty innovative and the exact thing that we need at more chapters here in the state. So kudos to you guys. I think you're leading a birding trip first thing tomorrow morning too, right? Yeah, so that's pretty cool. So thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be here. I'll share my screen with folks. Like Sal said, my name's Matt Allshouse, Conservation Ranching Program Manager for the state of California. I come here from Wyoming. I worked for a private consulting firm for about 10 years, and I decided I was done working for oil and gas and done working for the man. And so I pursued a passion of mine, which was a volunteer program for 6 years into a full-time position with the Peregrine Fund, doing research and conservation work in Central America on the orange-breasted falcon. And so I worked there in Central America for several years with orange-breasted falcon. I grew up on a ranch in Wyoming and have a passion for wild places. So when I heard about this position with Audubon, like incorporating soil science and plant species, community ecology, and birds and grazing, it was just like the perfect job for me. So I jumped ship and came out here. So I'm here to present about Audubon's Conservation Ranching Initiative. Like Sal said, this program has been operating here in California since 2019. And just a little bit on the background of the program. We're trying to use ranching as a conservation story. So we know that the ranchlands and rangelands of California provide habitat throughout the state. A lot of these ranches are either privately owned or privately managed, and they're providing all of these ecosystem services for wildlife and for people, whether that's, storing carbon, clean water, providing food, fiber, and open space. There aren't right now that many incentives, though, for these ranchers that are doing the work on the ground. Audubon sent out a survey to ranchers throughout the state, and this was several years ago, to find out what their interests are in selected ecosystem services. And pretty much across the board, ranchers came back that they want to improve wildlife habitat on their properties. We know that as we use ranching as a conservation story, a lot of these folks that we work with are land rich and cash poor. They don't have a lot of liquid assets to be able to put into restoration or reclamation, or into the basic infrastructure they need to protect wildlife. UC Berkeley and the California Rangeland Conservation Coalition a few years ago did an assessment looking at ecosystem services and putting monetary values on them. And as part of that assessment, they showed that every year, over 20,000 acres of rangelands are lost or converted in California every year. That's a pretty big number, and that's an old statistic, but they're lost to urbanization, suburbanization, ranchettes, as well as production agriculture. Sort of broadly keeping that in mind, California has about 40 million acres of rangeland. So those 40 million acres of rangelands are providing a lot of habitat. This is one of my favorite photos. I got it from Palayo, our program director. He came to us from the Carbon Cycle Institute, but previously the California Rangeland Conservation Coalition and Defenders for Wildlife. And you can tell in the photo that this thing is kind of retro. I don't know if it was taken in the late 90s or 2000s, but we got some funny hairstyles and colors as far as people's style. But it just goes to show that there have been conservation organizations working with ranchers in California for a long time. Audubon had their landowner stewardship program that started in 1999. Audubon's Bobcat Ranch was purchased in 2007. And there's been folks in this field for quite a while trying to partner with landowners and land managers like TNC, Point Blue, Defenders for Wildlife, as well as other coalitions. The purpose of Audubon's conservation ranching program was to create this market-based incentive to reward ranches for stewarding the land and doing good things for grassland bird habitat. I know most folks probably know like the genesis story of Audubon as a conservation organization, but I just thought I would bring it up. 120 years ago, an affluent group of women in Massachusetts found out that birds were going extinct, and bird populations were plummeting because of women's fashion, because they were using feathers in their hats. And so they started a campaign to change fashion so that feathers weren't in hats. And that was how Massachusetts Audubon started, and Audubon as a conservation organization started. Fast forward 120 years, and we're finally getting back into this market-based conservation concept with this bird-friendly seal. And the reason we're doing it is that about 5 years ago, Cornell and Audubon compiled a pretty comprehensive data set that shows birds are disappearing. And we all know that. Bird populations are declining across the board. And the group with the largest population declines are grassland bird species. Grassland birds have declined more than any other group. And I think this graph is kind of telling, because there's one group of birds that has actually increased in population over the past 50 years, and that's wetland birds. And that's because of protections to wetlands from the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers, and these things that we have done, and a lot of efforts from DU and Audubon chapters, but things we've done for wetlands and wetland birds. So it can be done. Here's another graph just showing the overall population declines 53%. 53% is close to 1 billion grassland birds. 1 billion birds that used to be here and aren't here anymore just in 50 years. So I think it was 2 years ago now, Audubon developed this tool called Survival by Degrees. And I don't know if you guys have seen it online. It's a cool interactive tool, but it looked at incremental increases in atmospheric carbon and associated temperature increases, and what the major threats to birds were going to be. And so those major threats were sea level rise, and this is all bird groups: sea level rise, urbanization, crop expansion, extreme spring heat, wildfires, and spring drought. We've been seeing all of these things happen in California, and quite a bit. As part of that analysis, they took a look at habitat utilization and behavior of every bird species in North America and modeled how their behavior and their habitat is going to shift with these incremental increases in temperature and the associated threats. About 47% of 47% of California's bird species are vulnerable, not grassland bird species. That's a typo. I knew it was Sierra's birthday today, so we decided to include the happy birthday meadowlark in this slide. But I think it's telling that, the Latin name is Sternella neglecta, because folks kind of neglect the Western meadowlark. To me, it's this icon of Western landscapes. It's not just my favorite because it's the state bird of Wyoming. It's also the state bird of 5 other states. But based on this modeling that Audubon did for Survival by Degrees, the Western meadowlark could be extirpated from all of California. Like that, to me, that's crazy. And that means we need to start doing things. The Eastern meadowlark obviously doesn't live in California, but there has been more analysis done on it and its populations, and those are paralleled in Western meadowlarks. When I go out to a grassland or a rangeland and I think of an indicator species for ecosystem health, it's the meadowlark. If you go out and you see two meadowlarks on a barbed wire fence, 50 years ago, there was 8 there. So we've lost 3 out of 4 meadowlarks. Well, in total, populations have fallen by 3% every year from 1966 to 2015. That's a cumulative decline of 89%. And the reason is they're grassland obligates. They nest on the ground. Their behavior is a ground forager. All of their food comes from grasslands. So their status is still a common bird, but they're in steep decline as an indicator species. I added a few others on here for all the birders in the group. The iconic species of California, the state bird, the California quail, will lose a significant portion of its range, which are on rangelands that are grazed in the state with this modeling, as well as the acorn woodpecker. This keystone species, the acorn woodpecker, preliminary lives in blue oak woodlands that are grassland oak savannas that are being grazed. So we know that the major threats to grasslands in particular are land conversion, poor management, invasive species, and climate change. So it presents us with this challenge. How do we affect change at a scale that can reverse these population declines and on overall management of these large areas? But it provides us an opportunity to connect consumers who are looking for farm to fork and sustainably raised beef in an ecologically and economically sustainable way. I don't want to move on too far without talking about fire a little bit and fire resiliency. It's on everyone's mind all the time now, and it's too bad that it takes a couple gigafires for us to start being proactive about fire and fire planning. Audubon's Bobcat Ranch, our flagship or demonstration site for the ACR program, has the highest return fire frequency in all of California. It's burned 8 of the past 10 years. It's kind of random. Half of those fires have started from boats. Boats are a weird thing to start a fire, but there's a highway that goes up Puda Creek to Lake Berryessa, and people pulling their boats drag their chains. And so those sparks keep igniting fires right next to the property. So 80% of Bobcat Ranch has burned in the past 10 years. This gives us, though, an opportunity to assess risk on the property. We've developed and maintained a really good relationship with CAL FIRE. We're going to be doing some prescribed burns this year. Provides an opportunity for us to monitor carbon over time. So really cool stuff, thinking about carbon flux over time in areas that are grazed or areas that are burned or areas that have had none of those impacts over time. So we know grassland birds are facing a crisis. How do we achieve significant lasting changes at scale to actually reverse population declines? Not just maintain where we are, but reverse the population declines. And that's by connecting these management practices on the ground to this market demand for healthy food and sustainability. This slide is used a lot. Our program started in the Midwest. It started in the tall grass prairie, worked its way into the midgrass, short grass, sagebrush, steppe, Chihuahuan grasslands, and then it came to California. California is kind of a different beast, but we know that these grassland ecosystems evolved with grazers. Grasses evolved with grazers. They evolved to be grazed. They evolved to respond to grazing and disturbance. And the wildlife that utilize them also evolved in areas that have disturbance, that have fire, that have a mosaic landscape. So we know that grazing can be used as a tool, not just to manage these ecosystems, but to provide the habitat that grassland birds rely on. So our program ties into this business piece for ranchers, because the number one question a rancher asks me when I come out and tell them about the program is, how much does it cost and what's in it for me? So a lot of people, obviously are worried about their bottom line. So we actually partner with ranchers as partners in the program in sustainable land management. And after they meet the criteria of the program, we certify the land the animal is grazed on. We don't certify beef. We certify the land that the animal is grazed on as bird friendly. And then we have a full marketing and communications team to try to connect ranchers with premium markets and offer promotion through the use of our ACR seal and communicating with chapters and affiliates to try to get the word out there. I'll talk a little bit about the Orvis Ranch. It's close to you guys. It's how I got introduced to Sierra. And Sierra, I'm not sure exactly who started these initial conversations. I think Susan Harper from Orvis Ranch reached out to Sierra because they on their own wanted to know more about what birds were on their property and what they could do for birds and bird habitat. And so she's been going out and surveying birds on their property for a long time now, fairly consistently, and has a pretty cool data set. This is Nora Harper, Susan's daughter, on their property. And I really wanted to highlight them because right now we're in a mega drought. And I work with producers throughout the southern slope of the Sierra and the San Joaquin Valley. And every one of those producers has the same problem. They have bare ground. They don't have much forage. They're not growing much grass. They're in this huge drought. They're getting runoff. Some places only received a few inches of precipitation this year. Basically, it's a desert. And then we can go to the Orvis Ranch, and they're growing grass like crazy. They're providing habitat for birds, and they're in the exact same situation as everyone else. And so that means they're doing good things for management. They're thinking proactively about drought. And so I really like to highlight them. And that's potentially one of the benefits of our program, is being able to network and connect ranchers to ranchers to share the story, instead of having me sit in front of a desk and tell someone how they should manage their land. So basically our program can empower consumers by telling the story of where these products come from, which rewards the good practices for the producers, creates the bird-friendly habitat, and then is followed up with the biological monitoring that we do to prove that the ideas that we have and the management is sound, and if not, be adaptive and able to change. I'll share a little bit about the breadth of our program nationally. We operate in 15 different states. Like I said, started in the tallgrass prairie of Missouri in the Midwest, and have kind of expanded upon this novel concept into a lot of different areas, over 100 ranchers, to over 2.5 million acres. And then we have national staff that are dedicated to the ACR program in communications and marketing, our national science team, and our national working lands program. So kind of cool to see. We have an issue here in California with the number of ranches, and I'll talk about that here in a little. But here's an overview of ACR California. When the program came here, it was my responsibility under my WCB grant to enroll and certify 3 ranches in addition to Audubon's Bobcat Ranch. So that's 4 ranches total for the program in California. The first 3 ranches I enrolled were actually ranching operations. And what I realized is that in the Midwest, these cow-calf operators, or these full life cycle operators, have a ranch. They have a contiguous property, potentially with some leases that are connected to that property, and that's their whole operation. Because of how biodiverse California is, and because of these precipitation gradients, if someone wants to finish cattle, they need several different properties in different counties and different ecoregions. So my first operator had 6 different properties in 3 different counties and 3 different ecoregions. And each one of the additional ranchers had that as well. So after we recruited 3 operators, it was 16 different parcels of land halfway across the state. And so that kind of exponentially increased the size of the program in itself. So 3 years in, we have 16 fully certified operators on 390,000 acres in 14 counties in the state. And that kind of bubble, or that exponential increase, didn't happen overnight, but it happened pretty quick with a brand partnership that Audubon established with Panorama Meats. So Panorama Meats is a brand of all organic, grass-fed, grass-finished, USA sourced beef. And they agreed that every one of their ranches that sources to them had to become Audubon certified. Well, 75% of their producers were in California. And so we've been doing hard work And it was kind of backwards because people usually reach out to us that they want to be a part of the program. And this was a brand telling all of their producers that they had to follow these requirements if they wanted to source. Right now, we have 4 more ranches or operations that are in the enrollment process and 16 on our wait list. So we have 16 operators who have reached out to us that want to be a part of the program, and we don't have the current capacity to enroll. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we're addressing that with different partnerships. So you can see here on the map, green is a fully certified ranch. So there's way more than 16 green dots. So this is like all of the different properties that are certified, ones that we have on the wait list, and ones that are enrolled. I'll talk a little bit about SB 977, and I really appreciate Sal's advocacy and his dedication to some of the bills that Audubon tried to push forward this year. He even joined calls where there wasn't enough attendees for other regions, other Audubon chapters. So that, shout out to Sal. That was really cool. We did try to push forward for the 2nd year in a row this conservation ranching incentive program, or a bill with the Senate. Senator Liard was the main author of the bill with Audubon. And basically it was developed and based on some programs Audubon has done with rice growers that gives folks or ag producers direct financial incentive to leave water on the ground longer. So in these rice paddies, rice growers would leave water on the ground longer after harvest, which would provide critical habitat for all of this waterfowl and shorebirds. Also, it created an environment for different types of micro and macro invertebrates in the water, little nymphs and bugs that would grow in the rice paddies, and then when they would be flushed, it acted as salmon food. So it had a lot of these benefits for hydrology, for salmon, for waterways, and for birds. Benefited them, and the direct financial incentive program benefited the landowners for doing it. So that was kind of our idea with the conservation ranching bill, is that it would be a direct financial incentive if a rancher is following these certain practices on their property. So the bill passed with full bipartisan support. Bipartisan support from every party. Everyone was 100% on board, which for a conservation bill is pretty rare these days. So that was a huge win for us. Unfortunately, the bill was held up in appropriations by the Appropriations Committee, and they did an analysis. They said they did an analysis on the bill and found that there were other programs in the state that did similar things that this incentive bill already does. Unfortunately, they don't. It was just wrong. And so we worked really hard to try to keep it alive, and it did not happen. It died. So this coming year, we're hoping to either A, rerun the bill, or B, develop a program under the Department of Conservation and the Wildlife Conservation Board that would set aside funds to do the same thing. So it wouldn't be the Audubon conservation ranching. It would just be conservation ranching for any producer who was following the recommendations. Moving on a little bit, I'll hop back into our programmatic stuff. Our program is based on 4 main protocols, and they're nationwide. And I'll just give a high-level overview, but these things are the foundation of how we develop plans and what we require for the certification. Forage and feeding. So we prohibit the use of antibiotics, growth hormones, or grain-based feeds. Animal health and welfare, basically following ASPCA standards for how to treat animals or use hormones. Environmental sustainability is a big one. This protocol overlaps a lot with an organic certification, so restricting the use of pesticides, herbicides, no neonicotinoids, and requires riparian protection, as well as considerations for soils, plant biodiversity, and pollinator habitat. The last one here, and it's actually first on the slide, but the last one I'll talk about is habitat management, because habitat management is what sets aside Audubon certification from any other beef certification on the market. No one else addresses habitat management. I've been out to ranches that are fully organic certified, they're Global Animal Partnership 4 or 5 certified, they're grass-fed, grass-finished, they're AGA, and they're still not doing anything for habitat on the ground. So how do we quantify or qualify habitat so that consumers know these places are providing it? And that's by this partnership that we do, creating habitat management plans for everywhere a producer grazes, and then being able to use that as a metric for success over time. This is just an example of a grazing management quick reference guide. A habitat management plan will give the entire history of a property. We map out the soil series, the vegetation components, the critical habitats, the wetlands, as well as all the infrastructure that a grazing operation has. And then think about ways that we can rotate animals to promote habitat or avoid sensitive areas. The meat and the bones of the habitat management plan really comes down to the goals and objectives. So we develop a list of goals and objectives to meet the rancher's needs for forage and from an operational standpoint, but also to meet our protocols. And so that's where we kind of work together on these goals and objectives. For Bobcat Ranch's habitat management plan, the #1 goal and objective was to increase staff capacity and infrastructure. And when I first read it, I was like, man, that's a weird thing for a conservation plan, like increase staff capacity and infrastructure. Well, the thing is that it's really hard to get work done on the ground if you don't have that capacity and you don't have the infrastructure. And so just as a basis, getting stock water to places, getting fences up, protecting riparian areas, that involves a lot of monetary input. So we work with ranchers to try to streamline the grant process, either through NRCS or Partners for Fish and Wildlife or other state programs, to get those projects on the ground as a starting point for conservation. Then addressing things like fire, soil health, plant communities, invasive species. Another thing that we do is identify priority birds on a particular property. And these don't necessarily have to be species of concern or groups with declining populations, but really to act as indicators of each of these fundamental elements of an ecosystem when we think about a mosaic and think about biodiversity. And so we'll map out the EPA's tier 3, tier 4 ecoregions on a place, and then kind of figure out what the critical components are for birds, and then give recommendations on a species by species basis. We have a third-party verifier. So Audubon isn't actually the one that certifies the product, the Food Alliance is. So the Food Alliance is a third-party verifier that uses our protocols as the standards for certification. And that way, there's no confusion about, oh, Audubon's like certifying a particular property. It's an independent entity that does the certification. They use our protocols. They do a desktop analysis of the habitat management plan, and then they do an on-site audit on the property to make sure all of these things are actually happening on the ground for folks. After they go through that process, if someone meets the requirements, they provide an official certification letter. And at that point, a producer can then start using Audubon seal, whether that's on their fences or in marketing and communications on social media, and preferably on their products so people know where it came from and what went into it. Monitoring, the bane of my existence. Monitoring is probably the most expensive thing that we do in our program. I talked a little bit about why it's important earlier to be able to tell our story. We've partnered with and adopted Point Blue Conservation Sciences range monitoring network methodology for our initial rounds of monitoring with the ranches that we've recruited. Knowing the cost of this monitoring on an individual basis, we're trying to get as much as we can done on the properties that are certified, or think of subsets of this information that can be useful for a producer and useful for telling the story for our program. For soil health, we look at all of these things that are really interconnected with the principles of soil health and with grazing. So soil texture, TOC, or total organic carbon in the soil, bulk density, and water infiltration. If folks have questions, I'm happy to hop into them after this. I have a background in soil science, but I'm going to keep going on a little bit. Vegetation, point line intercept transect methodology is what's used to gather vegetation data on ground cover, diversity, and species composition. And then for bird monitoring, we use Point Blue's point count methodology. So when we go out on the landscape and develop a plan for where to monitor, these points for vegetation and for soils are paired with bird monitoring locations. And so we have this paired data over time that is actually pretty cool to see how species composition changes based on soil attributes and how birds are utilizing those areas. What are the benefits to birds? This is a hard thing to quantify. It really is, especially on a micro or a macro scale. Audubon science team developed a tool called the Bird Friendliness Index, or the BFI. And it's actually pretty fascinating. The analysis and statistics behind it are a little bit over my head, but I'll explain a little to you guys. Basically, the BFI takes bird monitoring data from our individual ranches, looks at species abundance, diversity, and a ranking for resilience or different population trends over time on an individual basis, and then comes out with this BFI score. The BFI score is on a 0 to 1 scale, and the model is actually uses data from all sorts of other monitoring sources. So all sorts of databases from across the state, including eBird, to take a look geographically at how our ranches compare to the same types of ecosystems in surrounding areas. So each ranch is compared to adjacent areas with the same type of ecosystem. So that way we can tell how our particular ranch is doing compared to local averages, with the regional average always being set at 0.5. Landscape prioritization. I'm going to kind of zip through this one. When the program came to California, we wanted to make sure that we had the most bang for our buck as far as conservation. Where were the most critical areas that a program like ACR could impact? So we performed this landscape prioritization analysis that took into account 13 different factors, whether they were physical, biological, ecological, or socioeconomic. We put those into this hierarchy model, and the hierarchy model compares one factor to another factor on a 0 to 1 basis. It then takes all of those results and gives an overall ranking for each of those factors. We then took the ranking from each factor and overlaid its geospatial layer over the state of California. So this is just an example of what each layer looks like based on its ranking. Climate refugia on the left, or the resilience and resistance to an ecosystem to climate change, overlapping focal species ranges, and essential wildlife habitat connectivity. Those are just 3 of the 13. Then based on those rankings, we overlaid them over the entire state of California, and this is the pretty map that we came up with. Green being high priority areas based on the rankings, red being very low priority areas. Now, the thing that pops out at me right away in this is the red. So very low are areas that are already in production agriculture, have low priority for our program. Green, very high. I see the Central Coast. It scored really high for climate refugia. And the reason the model or the map looks the way it does is probably because of the top 4 or top 5 criteria that we thought were important. And those included climate refugia, overall species biodiversity, wildlife habitat connectivity, riparian connectivity. So now we have this figure, and it's a really cool tool. We don't want to use it to exclude an area from the program or to inequitably prioritize another geography for the program. But it's cool to sort of have forethought as we move forward for expansion. I think it's time that we actually revisit this tool. It's been 3 years now. And I think we have a better idea of the important components, the most important components of the program. And one thing that we didn't include here was underserved communities. And so that's a layer that we'd really like to incorporate. So this brings us to these opportunities for chapter engagement. One of the reasons I asked Sierra to talk to Sal to see if you guys wanted to have me talk was because we have a really cool opportunity for local Audubon chapters to be able to connect with their local ranchers, to know where their meat comes from, but also new areas to bird. My favorite part about my job is being able to go out to these places that no one else gets to see. I'm out on these private lands. They're not open to the public. The only people that see them are the people that work the land. And for me, it's fantastic. And I think it could be really cool for some folks that want to go bird in new areas and see new things, to be able to either adopt or form a relationship with their local rancher where they can go out and conduct monitoring. Right now, the current counties that we operate in are listed here. This is a map of Audubon chapter coverage in the state. And then when we think about different ways that monitoring data could be used when folks go out and bird, I know a lot of folks have a background in science and are fully capable of doing point count surveys, but also we get really useful information just from area searches, riparian transects, or just knowing where special habitat and species of concern are. We had a group go out on a ranch this past spring in San Luis Obispo County and found a stand of sycamore trees that were providing nesting habitat for purple martins. And they're not an uncommon species, but it's really uncommon for them to be nesting here, in particular in these cavities of sycamores. So that was just something cool that we found and that no one would ever know about if we're not out there looking at these things. Another opportunity is just this networking piece, being able to share the story about grazing. There's a lot of areas throughout the West that have been overgrazed. Grazing is an issue everywhere. We don't want to say that grazing is a good thing in every situation, but good management definitely is. So being able to share that story that grazing is an integral part of a lot of grassland ecosystems. Grazing has the potential to improve soil health, reduce runoff, and create ecosystems that are actually more resistant and resilient to drought. And that practices or adjusting practices not just benefit grassland bird populations, but can benefit a variety of other wildlife too. The last piece is purchasing power. Someone from Audubon National, when I first joined, told me I'd feel good about buying a pack of beef. If it's ACR certified, they said, you're going to feel good when you buy it. And I thought that was pretty hokey. I'm like, I'm not going to feel good buying beef. Like, no one feels good when they buy something like that. I went to my local co-op in Laramie, Wyoming, and it's a small place. I saw ACR beef there. And I was like, wow, that's cool. They have this. And I pulled out a package and it was from the Reed Ranch. Well, I had done sagebrush and sage grouse restoration work on the Reed Ranch like 10 years previous. I was like, I know this place. That's really cool. And I went up front and I bought it and I actually felt good about buying my beef. I knew where it came from. I knew all of the work that they were doing on that ranch for this critical sage grouse habitat. And I felt good about my purchase. So it is possible to feel good when you buy beef. Anyway, here's a list of some of our main operators and retailers. And then we actually have this interactive map online on our website here, where you can click on the link and you can scroll over the map and you can look at where product is available. And so that's pretty cool. A lot of our operators right now are direct to market. So they sell directly to people, which is what the Orvis Ranch does. And so Orvis Ranch, you can't go to the store and buy, you need to contact them directly. And that's the same for a lot of folks. But that's a piece that we can improve on. So our next step, or our next steps to the program, are to engage with chapters and collaborate on this monitoring and outreach piece. connect consumers to ranches, being able to tell the story of our ranches and the things that they're doing on the ground with the local consumers that they'll be providing. We want to certify more ranches and link them. Once we get this network going, knowing that an animal has to spend a certain amount of its life on ACR certified land, it creates a market and kind of the snowball effect. We definitely want to expand retailers so it's easier for people to get products. Incorporating EDI&B, this was part of a previous slideshow, and I don't think that should be a next step. That should be part of every step. It's really hard, and I might blow people away here, and I don't want to dissuade anyone. But when we try to think about incorporating equity and diversity and inclusion into a program that's centered around beef is pretty hard. And I kind of think about this idea. It's like rich white men benefiting from privileged consumers from stolen land. It's a hard thing to wrap your head around. And I don't want to dissuade anyone from thinking too deeply about it, but we need to recognize that, this land, especially a part of these big ranches, was stolen. And there is a contingent or group of people that are benefiting from it. And so being able to think outside the box when we think about EDI&B is hopefully in every step of the process as we expand the program. And we have a lot of ideas and have been collaborating with a lot of different folks in different ways. But I just wanted to bring that up at the end of this. Also, using adaptive management. That's the key. There's no silver bullet for grassland conservation, for bird conservation. We have a lot of tools in our toolbox, but things might not always work the way we think they're going to. And if they do, we want to keep doing them. And so being able to use our monitoring data, being able to collaborate with people from around the state or around the country to think of new and innovative ideas is a huge part of it. So I think I'm at about 40 minutes on the presentation, but I wanted to thank folks and hopefully open it up to a round of discussion and questions.